The year is 2010, and the European continent feels like it is coming apart at the seams. If you were standing in the halls of power in Brussels or Frankfurt during those dark months, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The headlines were screaming about the end of the European project. Greece was burning, its economy exposed as a ruin of debt and mismanagement. Spain was watching its housing market collapse into dust, dragging its banking sector down with it. Italy, a giant of industry, was gasping for air, unable to service its mounting debts. The financial markets, those invisible and merciless judges of national fortunes, had turned their gaze toward the Eurozone, and they smelled blood. But amidst this chaos, all eyes turned to one capital city. And it was not Paris, nor London, nor Brussels. It was Berlin. The world was asking one singular question: will Germany pay the bill? Will the German taxpayer open their wallet to save the euro? At that precise moment in history, Germany stood as the undisputed monarch of Europe. It was the paymaster, the economic engine, the vault where the money was kept. Its chancellor, Angela Merkel, was the de facto leader of the continent, her decisions capable of saving or destroying entire national economies with a single nod. But if you were to pull the camera back from this scene of German dominance and look toward the West, you would find another major power standing on the sidelines, watching the unfolding disaster with a mixture of impotence and deep historical regret. That nation was France. France, the country that had viewed itself for centuries as the diplomatic heart of Europe, the intellectual architect of the European Union, and the indispensable power that balanced the continent. France told itself that it should be the one leading this response, that it should be the refuge, the equal partner, the voice of authority. Instead, Paris found itself paralyzed. The French leadership discovered, to their horror, that they could not object to German demands. They were forced to smile for the cameras, stand next to the German chancellor, and nod in agreement with austerity measures they privately detested, simply to keep the markets calm and the European ship from sinking. France had been reduced to a junior partner, a passenger in a vehicle driven by Berlin. But the bitterest irony of the situation, the detail that makes this a true historical tragedy, is that France's helplessness was not the result of bad luck or German aggression. It was the result of a trap that France had built with its own hands. It was a golden cage designed decades earlier to contain German power, to bind the German giant so tight that it could never dominate Europe again. That cage was the euro. And in a twist of fate that no one in the Élysée Palace had anticipated, France had built the cage, shoved Germany inside, and then somehow locked themselves in with the beast, only to find that the beast was much stronger than they were. How did a nation as sophisticated and historically savvy as France make such a catastrophic miscalculation? To understand how France engineered its own economic subordination, we cannot look at the spreadsheets of 2010. We must travel back in time to a very specific, cold, and terrifying moment in history. November 9th, 1989. This was the night the Berlin Wall fell. For the vast majority of the world, this was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The images are iconic. Young people in denim jackets climbing the concrete barrier, smashing it with sledgehammers, families reuniting in tears, the crumbling of the Iron Curtain. It was the end of the Cold War, the triumph of freedom. But while the champagne was flowing in the streets of Berlin and the television anchors in New York were celebrating the end of history, the mood in the highest offices of Paris and London was one of dread. François Mitterrand, the President of France, sat in the Élysée Palace, and he was not celebrating. He was staring into the abyss. Mitterrand was a man of the old world, a man who had lived through the Second World War, who had been a prisoner of war, who knew in his bones what European history was really about. When he looked at the jubilant crowds in Berlin, he didn't see freedom. He saw the return of France's oldest and most terrifying nightmare, a unified Germany. For more than a century, French foreign policy had been predicated on one single overriding imperative: keep Germany weak or keep it divided. A unified Germany sitting right in the center of the continent, with a population roughly 25% larger than France's and an industrial base vastly superior to France's, was an existential threat. The secret diplomatic cables and private archives from that winter reveal a level of panic that was carefully hidden from the public. Mitterrand was not just worried, he was desperate. He believed that a unified Germany would inevitably return to its old habits of dominance. Across the English Channel, his great ideological rival, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was in a state of even greater agitation. Thatcher and Mitterrand agreed on almost nothing. She was the champion of free markets and deregulation. He was a socialist intellectual. But on the subject of Germany, they were soulmates. In a private meeting that has since become legendary among historians, Mitterrand told Thatcher that a unified Germany might have more influence in Europe than Hitler ever did. He wasn't talking about armies or tanks. He was talking about sheer gravity, economic and political weight that would turn the rest of Europe into satellites of Berlin. This was the fear that consumed Paris in the winter of 1989. And it was this fear that would lead France to make the deal that would haunt it for decades. By early 1990, Mitterrand realized that his obstruction strategy had failed. Germany was going to unite. The old strategy of containment through division was dead. The United States under George H.W. Bush supported reunification, and the Soviet Union was too bankrupt and exhausted to stand in the way. France needed a new strategy, and fast. If they could not stop Germany from becoming a giant, they had to find a way to tie the giant down. They needed to bind this new Germany so tightly to Europe that it could never act alone again. Mitterrand gathered his advisors and crafted a plan that was as audacious as it was risky. He decided that the price of France's signature on the reunification treaty would be the very soul of German power. He would demand that Germany give up the Deutsche Mark. To understand why this was the chosen weapon, you have to understand what the Deutsche Mark meant. It was not just a currency. It was the national religion of post-war Germany. The Germans had lost their flag, their army, and their national pride after 1945. The only thing they were allowed to be proud of was their economy. And the symbol of that economy was the mark. It represented stability, hard work, and savings. More importantly, it was the most dominant currency in Europe. Throughout the 1980s, the German central bank, the Bundesbank, had essentially run the European economy from its tower in Frankfurt. The Bundesbank cared about one thing and one thing only: fighting inflation. They didn't care if France had high unemployment or if Italy needed to stimulate growth. If the Bundesbank felt prices were rising in Germany, they raised interest rates. And because the German economy was so massive, everyone else had to follow. If France didn't raise its rates to match Germany, investors would sell their francs and buy marks, causing the French currency to crash. This dynamic had humiliated Mitterrand earlier in his presidency. In 1981, he had been elected on a radical socialist platform, promising to increase wages, nationalize banks, and lower retirement ages. He tried to spend his way to prosperity, but the financial markets panicked. Money fled to Germany, and the Bundesbank refused to help. By 1983, Mitterrand was forced to crawl back, abandon his socialist dreams, and impose austerity just to stop the bleeding. He had never forgotten that humiliation. He realized that as long as the Deutsche Mark existed, France would never be sovereign. Germany would always hold the whip hand. So the logic of the euro was born. Mitterrand thought, if we force them to dissolve the mark and join a single currency, decisions will no longer be made by the Bundesbank in Frankfurt alone. They will be made by a European central bank where France has a vote. We will dilute German power into a European pool. It was a geopolitical calculation. France was willing to bet its economic future on a political gamble. In late 1989, at a summit in Strasbourg, Mitterrand played his hand. He effectively issued an ultimatum to German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. If Germany wanted a smooth path to reunification, if they wanted France's blessing and not a hostile diplomatic war, they had to commit to the single currency. Helmut Kohl was stuck. He was a man of history, a visionary who wanted to see Germany whole again above all else. He knew that the German people hated the idea of giving up the mark. Polls at the time showed that nearly 70% of Germans were opposed to the euro. They trusted their mark. They did not trust vague new money shared with Italians and Greeks. But Kohl was also a pragmatist. He knew he couldn't unite Germany against the will of France and Britain. He needed Mitterrand. But there was a problem, so Kohl made a decision that would shape the next 30 years of history. He agreed. He sacrificed the Deutsche Mark on the altar of reunification. He acted against the advice of his own economists and the will of his own people to secure the political dream of a united Germany. But, and this is the crucial but that France missed, Kohl did not surrender unconditionally. Helmut Kohl agreed to the euro, yes, but he demanded that this new currency be built to German specifications. If France wanted a shared currency, Germany insisted that the new European Central Bank, the ECB, be a clone of the Bundesbank. It had to be independent of politicians. It had to be forbidden from printing money to fund government deficits. Its only mandate could be price stability. And to add a symbolic exclamation point to this arrangement, the ECB would be headquartered in Frankfurt, not Paris. This was the deal. France got its single currency. Germany got to design the rules. At the time, French economists warned that this was a trap. They pointed out that a single currency without a single fiscal policy would create massive imbalances. Countries with different productivity levels, different labor markets, and different industrial structures would be locked into the same exchange rate and the same interest rate. Without the ability to devalue their currency or set their own monetary policy, weaker economies would be crushed. But Mitterrand dismissed these warnings. He was playing the long game. He believed that once the euro was established, political integration would follow. France would gradually gain control over European economic policy. The Germans would be forced to compromise, to soften their rigid rules, to accept that Europe was more than just an extension of German economic philosophy. Instead of a German Europe, there would be a European Europe, with France as the intellectual and diplomatic leader. It was a beautiful vision, and it was completely wrong. The Maastricht Treaty was signed on February 7, 1992, by 12 European countries. The treaty laid the foundations for the euro and established strict convergence criteria. Countries had to keep their budget deficits below 3% of GDP and their public debt below 60% of GDP to qualify. These were, of course, German rules designed to prevent fiscal profligacy. But there was another problem that almost no one in Paris saw coming. The euro was not just a neutral currency. It was a currency custom-built for the German economy. Germany is an export powerhouse, a nation of engineers and manufacturers that thrives on selling high-quality goods to the rest of the world. For decades, Germany's export success had been constrained by one thing: the appreciation of the Deutsche Mark. Every time German exports surged, the mark would rise in value, making German goods more expensive and cooling demand. But in the euro, that adjustment mechanism disappeared. Germany was now locked into a currency with countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, and France, countries with lower productivity and weaker export sectors. The euro was undervalued for Germany and overvalued for everyone else. For Germany, it was like a high-performance sports car suddenly given a flat road with no speed limit. German exports exploded. From 2000 to 2010, Germany's unit labor costs rose by roughly 20 to 30% less than its main Eurozone competitors. This meant German exports became about 20% more competitive, but there was no change in the exchange rate. The euro permanently fixed the rates. If Germany had its own currency, the D-mark would have appreciated by 15 to 20%, rebalancing demand. But in the euro, there was no currency revaluation. France, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging competitiveness. French industry couldn't match German efficiency. French labor costs were rising faster. French factories were closing, replaced by German imports. Between 2000 and 2016, France lost more than 2% of its global market share per year. Its current account shifted from rough balance to a persistent deficit. The economic machinery of the euro was grinding French industry into dust, and there was nothing France could do about it. They couldn't devalue their currency. They couldn't lower interest rates to stimulate growth. They couldn't print money to fund infrastructure or innovation. All the traditional tools of economic policy had been surrendered to the ECB in Frankfurt, which was run according to German rules, with German priorities. By the mid-2000s, French policymakers were beginning to understand the trap they were in. But to admit that the euro, the grand project of French diplomacy, was failing France would have been political suicide. So instead of reforming, France turned to debt. If the private sector could no longer generate wealth because it couldn't compete with Germany, the French state would step in. They hired more civil servants. They subsidized struggling industries. They maintained a generous welfare state funded not by taxes on production, but by borrowing cheap money. And the money was incredibly cheap. This was another perverse side effect of the euro trap. Because France shared a currency with Germany, investors assumed that France was as creditworthy as Germany. French government bonds carried interest rates nearly identical to German bonds. It was as if France had borrowed Germany's credit rating. For a decade, this masked the underlying problem. France could borrow cheaply and paper over its declining competitiveness with deficit spending. But debt is not wealth. Debt is a claim on future wealth, and that's when everything changed. In 2008, the global financial crisis struck. Banks collapsed. Credit markets froze. Suddenly, investors woke up and realized that not all Eurozone countries were equally solid. Greece admitted it had been lying about its deficit figures. Its debt-to-GDP ratio was over 120%. Spain's housing bubble burst. Italy's borrowing costs spiked, and the markets turned their attention to France. France was not in as dire a position as Greece or Spain, but it was clearly struggling. Its current account deficit revealed a deep competitiveness problem. Its budget deficit exceeded 3% of GDP. Its public debt was rising steadily toward 100% of GDP. Without the ability to devalue or print money, France was trapped in a slow-motion economic decline. And in that moment, Germany held all the cards. Germany had spent the 2000s becoming even stronger. Its current account surplus had surged to 8.5% of GDP by 2015, a record level. It had cash, it had credibility, it had the power to decide whether to bail out the weaker Eurozone countries or let them collapse. Angela Merkel, Germany's chancellor, became the de facto leader of Europe. Her decisions could save or destroy entire economies. France, the architect of the euro, the nation that had designed the cage to contain Germany, found itself paralyzed. The French leadership discovered that they could not object to German demands. Germany wanted austerity. Germany wanted fiscal discipline. Germany wanted Southern Europe to cut spending, slash wages, and endure years of recession to restore competitiveness. And France, despite its reservations, had to go along. Because if France broke ranks, if it challenged Germany openly, the markets would turn on France. French borrowing costs would spike. The European project would unravel. So France smiled for the cameras and nodded along. The euro trap was fully visible. France had hoped the euro would make it a co-leader of Europe. Instead, The euro had stripped France of its economic sovereignty. When the crisis meetings happened, France had no leverage. Its economy was weak, its deficits were high, and it had no control over its currency. Germany, with its overflowing coffers and robust industry, held all the cards. The European decisions that Mitterrand had dreamed of turned out to be German decisions stamped with a European flag. France had wanted to bind Germany to Europe to prevent it from dominating. They succeeded in binding Germany. But they failed to foresee that in a bound system, the strongest economy dominates even more thoroughly than in a free one. In a free system, exchange rates adjust to level the playing field. In a fixed system, the strong devour the weak. Mitterrand's dream of a political Europe controlling the economy was shattered by the reality of a German economic machine that controlled the politics. This is the great tragedy of the euro for France. It was a geopolitical masterstroke that became an economic suicide note. Mitterrand feared the German soldier. He should have feared the German accountant. He feared the tanks crossing the Rhine. He should have feared the Audis and Mercedes crossing the border tariff-free, backed by a currency that was tailor-made for German dominance. France dug a hole for Germany, expecting to bury German ambition. Instead, they fell into it themselves, and they have been trying to climb out ever since. The unrest, the stagnation, and the political turmoil we see in France today are the aftershocks of that fateful decision in 1989, the decision to prioritize a political dream over economic reality, the decision to build a cage for Germany without understanding that the cage would become a prison for France. By 2025, the pattern is undeniable. France's public debt exceeds 114% of GDP. Its current account remains in deficit. Its industrial base continues to erode relative to Germany's. Youth unemployment remains stubbornly high. And politically, France has become increasingly volatile, with populist movements on both the left and right gaining ground by promising to break free from the euro. But breaking free is not so simple. The euro is now embedded in every contract, every savings account, every pension plan in France. To leave the euro would trigger economic chaos, bank runs, inflation, currency collapse. France is locked in. The cage that Mitterrand built has no exit, and inside that cage, Germany remains the strongest, setting the rules, deciding the policies, controlling the destiny of Europe. The lesson of the euro is this: economic power cannot be contained by political agreements. You cannot trap a stronger economy with legal structures and expect to emerge as the leader. If you lock yourself in a room with someone stronger than you, eventually they will dominate. The only way to compete with economic strength is to build economic strength. France tried to solve a political problem with a monetary trick. It wanted to bind Germany without having to match Germany's productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness. It wanted to be Germany's equal through institutional design rather than economic performance. And history has shown with brutal clarity that this does not work. Today, we see echoes of this pattern around the world. The United States and China are locked in an economic competition where both sides are trying to bind the other with trade agreements, tariffs, and technology restrictions. But the ultimate winner will not be determined by who writes the best rules. It will be determined by who builds the most productive economy, who innovates faster, who educates their population better, and who adapts more quickly to changing conditions. France's tragedy is a warning. You cannot legislate yourself to greatness. You cannot contain a rival by building a cage that traps you both, and you cannot ignore the fundamental laws of economics in pursuit of a political dream. The euro backfired. France tried to contain Germany, but enslaved itself. And the story is not over. As the global economy shifts, as new powers rise and old ones decline, the euro remains the most visible symbol of what happens when political ambition collides with economic reality. The question is, will Europe learn the lesson, or will the next generation repeat the same mistake? This concludes the story of how France built a golden cage for Germany and locked itself inside. It teaches us that economic systems are not neutral tools. They reflect power, they enforce hierarchies, and they punish those who ignore their underlying logic. This pattern repeats whenever nations prioritize appearances over fundamentals, whenever they try to contain a rival without addressing their own weaknesses, whenever they believe that clever institutional design can substitute for hard economic work. If you want to understand tomorrow's world, you need to understand yesterday's economics. Because when the history books are written about our era, they will ask the same question historians now ask about France and the euro. How did they not see this coming? Subscribe now to uncover more of the hidden economic forces that shape empires, destroy nations, and decide the future. Because in the game of economic history, ignorance is not bliss. It's a death sentence. This is the hidden history, and the patterns are always repeating. You just need to know where to look.